Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is Korea and MacArthur. The year is 1950, and the focus on the Korean peninsula, which had been separated after World War II into two distinct countries. How did that come about? Well, Japan had occupied Korea during World War II, and at the end of the war, the Japanese soldiers in the north surrendered to soldiers from the Soviet Union. In the south, they surrendered to soldiers from the United States. So the agreement after the war was, well, let's just divide this. They picked the 38th parallel as the division point, kind of in the middle of the country. The north would be under Kim Il-sung, basically aligned to the Soviets. In the south, the democratically elected Syngman Rhee was in charge, basically aligned to the United States. Well, after a couple of years, things were pretty stable, and in 1949, the Americans withdrew the last of their troops really to focus on Europe with its military presence, and that's basically the way things were until June the 25th of 1950. On that day, Harry Truman was in Independence, Missouri, and he gets a phone call, 9:20 at night, from his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who tells him of an invasion. North Korea is invading South Korea. Not just a skirmish, a full-on invasion, and it was clear it was backed by the Soviets because the Soviet equipment, tanks, artillery, was all part of this. Well, Truman had concern written all over his face. According to Margaret Truman, his daughter, she said, "My father made it clear from the moment he heard the news that he feared this was the opening of World War III. That thought was on his mind throughout this conflict, remembering, of course, that the Soviets had tested an atomic bomb just the previous year. World War III was something that had to be avoided, but also to be avoided was appeasement. Truman got back to the Washington, D.C. the next day sort of full of resolve. This can't stand. He met with his national security team that night at Blair House, and they agreed if we let this go, if we appease the Russians in Korea, there'll be no stopping them. The communist expansion will not only go on in Asia, it will go on in Europe. We've got to stop this. We've got to get the United Nations involved. And that's where Dean Acheson came into play to go talk to the Security Council to actually issue a call for nations to come to the aid of the South Koreans. And they got that passed. Within a day, 9-0 was the vote. Unanimous in the Security Council. Well, how is that possible with the Soviet Union part of the Security Council? Well, the Soviets had actually walked out of the UN Security Council a few months before. They were upset over what was going on in China and China's seat on the council. The Chinese under Mao Zedong, the communists under Mao Zedong, had actually taken over China. They had finally kicked Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists out, who were now out in Taiwan, but the United Nations had not yet recognized the communist authority in China. So the seat in the Security Council still belonged for China with Chiang Kai-shek, and the Russians weren't going to tolerate that anymore, so they walked out of the council. That made it so that this would be unanimous. More than a dozen nations would join the United States in this military conflict to try to push the North Koreans back at least to the 38th parallel or even further north. That movement to the United Nations was key for Harry Truman. If we had not persuaded the United Nations to back up the Free Republic of Korea, he said, Western Europe would have gone into the hands of the communists. Again, thinking about those domino effects. General Douglas MacArthur had been serving as the supreme commander of the Allied powers in the Reconstruction period in Japan. So he's in the region, a five-star general. He was now put in charge as the supreme commander of the UN forces in Korea. Strong support in the United States at this point to stand up to the Russians, stand up to the communists, big increase in defense spending because Congress was on board as well, but that support actually dissipated rather quickly, including in Congress. One of the reasons was the decision by the Truman administration not to seek a formal declaration of war. This was Dean Acheson's position, is that Truman didn't need to do this, let's not bother, it'll be a distraction, you're the commander-in-chief, you can order this on your own authority. Now, historically in the United States, per the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the sole authority to declare war. And in every major conflict in American history to date, that had been the case. The executive goes to Congress, asks for the declaration. If they get a declaration of war, the U.S. goes to war. That did not happen in this particular fight, and in fact, has not happened since. Harry Truman set a precedent, and major military conflicts since, whether it was in Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia, wherever it's been, The U.S. hasn't had a formal declaration of war from Congress since World War II. So if it wasn't a war, what was it? Well, Harry Truman was asked at a press conference, Mr. President, would it be correct to call this a police action under the United Nations? And Truman responded, yes, that's exactly what it amounts to. It all felt like a war, but they're going to call it a police action with no congressional authority. Well, for the first couple of months of this police action, it was a terrible experience for the South Koreans, who basically were overrun. Just the equipment alone, the tanks and artillery coming from the Soviets, way too much for the South Koreans and the UN forces who were trying to pour in that could stop. And basically, the entire UN contingent was pushed back by mid-August down in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula in the Pusan area, port city there. That's where all of the forces were basically in a small community there where they had set up a line, a defensive line at the Pusan perimeter, bringing in more equipment and more men, hoping at some point that they would then be able to break out against the North. But Douglas MacArthur had another idea in mind, a creative, bold, risky plan to actually get behind the enemy, behind enemy lines. His idea was to land a large force at Inchon, which is on the in the middle part of the Korean peninsula, the northern section of South Korea, not too far from the capital of Seoul. This was relatively unguarded. Why? Because everyone thought it was impractical to land any kind of a military force there. There were no beaches at Inchon, just these huge 30-foot seawalls, and the only time ships could really come in was at the very highest tide. When they did that, it would be a small window to try to actually get men off. Most people thought this was completely impractical, but not Douglas MacArthur. He had this plan that that's where he was going to come in, and that way they could change the entire nature of the war. Put this plan on the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in Washington, D.C. They reviewed it. It was clearly risky. It was bold. Could go either way. They decided to recommend yes to Harry Truman. If anybody could pull this off, it was going to be Douglas MacArthur. Truman said yes. September 15th was the target date. And sure enough, MacArthur pulled it off and then some. He landed 70,000 men on 262 ships. It was a near perfect military assault. They captured Inchon in a day. They had Seoul captured within 10 days. And at the same time, the UN forces did push out of that Pusan perimeter area. And now the North Koreans basically running for their lives back to the 38th parallel. By October 1st, in just a couple of weeks, all the ground that had been lost had been regained. Douglas MacArthur, an absolute hero. This was a miraculous outcome from a military standpoint, and he got updated orders. Let's go finish the job. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Truman issued orders that MacArthur was to go into the North, cross the 38th parallel, and destroy the North's ability to wage war in the future. Harry Truman was always leery of Douglas MacArthur. He wasn't really a fan. At one point at the end of World War II, he said, Mr. Prima Donna, Brass Hat, Five-Star MacArthur, he's worse than the Cabots and the Lodges. They at least talked with one another before they told God what to do. Mac tells God right off. It's a very great pity we have to have stuffed shirts like that in key positions. They were very different, and Truman was leery of the commander, so he had never met MacArthur in person, and he wanted to do so, establish some kind of a personal relationship, and make sure they were on the same page, because MacArthur was talking perhaps about a grander conflict, bringing the fight not just into the North, but all the way into China. Truman was adamantly against that, because again, he thought that would expand this conflict, and once again, you'd have that risk of going into World War III. So Truman wanted to meet MacArthur. MacArthur wasn't going to come to Washington, because that was going to take him away from the battlefield for too long. They agreed to meet in the Pacific at Wake Island, October the 15th. And sure enough, it was a very cordial, positive meeting. Truman lands, MacArthur's there at the bottom of the steps of his plane as he gets off, big handshakes, big smiles. They go off to a Quonset hut, just a couple of them, for about 30 minutes talking back and forth. Very cordial, very much on the same page. Then all the teams came together for a 2-hour conference. MacArthur had his staff there. Truman had his national security team there. And basically, MacArthur was kind of full of bravado. He was completely optimistic and confident after the big success at Inchon. He basically said, look, there's no way China's coming into this conflict. Don't worry about that. The war's going to be over by Thanksgiving. Troops will be coming home by December. We're going to push all the way to the Yalu River. We're going to destroy the ability of the North to make war. Don't worry about this. We've got it. Well, Truman left Wake Island actually in a pretty positive outlook as MacArthur went and began executing on that model. So that was on October the 15th. 2 weeks later, Truman is having lunch. This is November the 1st of 1950 at Blair House. He's having lunch with Bess and with Margaret. After that, he goes upstairs to his bedroom to take a nap before his afternoon activities. In the meantime, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola started approaching Blair House. They started approaching and then they opened fire on the guards outside of Blair House. And all of a sudden, 27 shots rang out in the next 2 minutes. Collazo fired first and hit Donald Birdzell with 2 bullets immediately. Leslie Coffelt, the officer, was hit in the chest. He went down. That was a shot by Torresola. Joseph Downs, another officer, was hit 3 times as he was lunging for the door, sort of crying for help to get more people down there. Again, shots firing back and forth. Torresola was hit next. He was hit in the ear, he was hit in the chest, he went down. Coffelt was dying right there on the scene, on the sidewalk on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of Blair House. But before he died, he got off 1 shot, hit Torresola in the head, and he was dead. Now, all of this was going on very rapidly. Harry Truman heard it through his open window. He comes to that window, and people on the street are yelling to the president, get back, which he did. When all things were done, 2 men lay dead, one of the assassins and one of the officers. Coffelt died. He was 40 years old. He had been on the Secret Service since 1942. Collazo would recover from his injuries. He would go to prison. Actually, he was convicted. He was sentenced to death. Truman commuted that to life in prison. Eventually, he was let go by Jimmy Carter a couple of decades later. So what was all of this all about? Who were Collazo and who was Torresola? Well, they were Puerto Rican nationalists. There had been a vote just a couple of days before in Puerto Rico about whether or not to try to seek independence from the United States. It did not go their way, and they wanted to make a name for their cause. And they thought if they would attack the president, maybe assassinate him, this would bring attention to them. It certainly brought attention to them in the most violent way possible, and it cost a Secret Service man his life. One of them died as well. But Harry Truman, he was really unfazed by this. Yes, they upped his security a little bit more. He said, but look, they're not going to get the best of me. I'm going to continue and do my job. The worst news for Truman really came a couple of weeks later, November the 24th. By now, they're in Korea. Douglas MacArthur and his men, sure enough, had pushed the north all the way back to the Yellow River, right near the Chinese border. Kind of ominous for the Chinese, who weren't going to take this anymore. They sent 30 divisions, 260,000 men into Korea to fight the Americans and to fight the United Nations team. It was a whole new war. Truman said, this is the worst situation we've had yet. We'll just have to meet it as we've met all the rest. But again, whole new war, Douglas MacArthur being pushed back toward that 38th parallel, and also putting in a conflict that we're going to see now between MacArthur and Harry Truman, because they had different views as to what was happening. For MacArthur, he just wanted to win at all costs in Korea, which meant if he had to go attack the Chinese, he wanted to do that. Their ports, their industry. He even talked about using atomic weapons against the Chinese to finish them once and for all. Well, Harry Truman said no. We can't do that. Sure, we need to win in Korea. We need to check that advance at the 38th parallel, but I'm not in this to start World War III. Truman said, there was no doubt in my mind that we should not allow the action in Korea to extend to a general war. All-out military action against China had to be avoided, if for no other reason than because it was a gigantic booby trap. He and MacArthur were not on the same page. MacArthur's forces were pushed back to the 38th parallel, where they basically tried to hold the line. They were pushed further into the south. This was a perilous situation, but Truman was adamant. No activity against the Chinese. You got to fight this battle within the boundaries of Korea. A lot of stress going on right now. It's December the 5th, one of the worst days in Harry Truman's presidency. On a personal level, Charlie Ross, his press secretary, the man he had known since high school that he had brought into his administration, one of his closest friends and confidants in the administration, is at his desk doing his job, and he dies of a heart attack. Boom, it is over, and Truman is distraught over this. That night, to get a little bit of relaxation, they had actually scheduled Bess and Harry Truman were going to go see their daughter, Margaret Truman, perform in a concert. Margaret had recently graduated from George Washington University in Washington, and she'd become a professional singer. And she was going to give a concert in Washington, D.C. The Trumans went. They actually had a very nice time until 5:30 the next morning when Harry Truman blew his top. A sharp critique by Paul Hume in the Washington Post that basically panned Margaret Truman's performance, and Harry Truman lost it. Now, Harry Truman would often sort of have these visceral reactions to news, and he would get out his pen and he would write some nasty letter back to someone to try to prove a point, and almost always he would take that letter, second thoughts, he would shove it in a drawer, he would not send it because he knew it would not do any good. In this case, he sent it. He wrote the letter, he addressed the envelope, he put the letter in it, he put a stamp on it and sent it off to be mailed, all before most people were even up in the morning. He was so angry. In that letter, he said, "It seems to me that you are a frustrated old man who wishes he could have been successful. When you write such poppycock as was in the back section of the paper you work for, it shows conclusively that you're off the beam. Someday I hope to meet you. When that happens, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beefsteak for black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below. Harry Truman." Well, this backfires on Harry Truman. He sends it, it gets out, it's republished elsewhere, and frankly, people were upset at Truman. How could he be focused on something so inconsequential when our American boys are dying over in Korea? He thought maybe if it got out that people would see he was just writing as a father, as a citizen, Harry Truman, and fathers around the country would support him. It did not play that way at all. Truman's popularity is already going down because the war is increasingly unpopular, the attack by the Chinese, the rising body counts, and now this on top of it did not go well. When the Americans and the UN forces did start to gain some ground back, Matthew Ridgway had taken over the 8th Army. They retook Seoul in January of 1951, got back to the 38th parallel by March, and Truman thought this is the time, frankly, to go for peace. This goal had been established. They had pushed the North back. They were back to the 38th parallel, status quo from before the war, and let's go for peace. Well, told MacArthur he was going to do this, and then MacArthur completely undermined him with his own public statement. MacArthur said, March the 23rd, "The enemy Red China, therefore, must by now be painfully aware that a decision by the United Nations to depart from its tolerant effort to contain the war to the area of Korea through an expansion of our military operations to its coastal areas and interior bases would doom Red China to the risk of imminent military collapse." Well, this was not the policy of Harry Truman. Even to threaten it was not the policy of Harry Truman. He wanted to go for a peace settlement at the time. He was outraged that MacArthur would do this. He said that he prevented a ceasefire proposition right there. "I was ready to kick him into the North China Sea at that time. I was never so put out in my life. It's the lousiest trick a commander-in-chief can have done to him by an underling." He wanted to fire MacArthur, and others were recommending that he do the same. The problem was MacArthur was enormously popular. Harry Truman was not. This could be politically perilous. It could put the war effort at risk. Truman was going to wait just a little bit longer because he knew MacArthur would probably step in it again and hang himself, which is exactly what happened, and it didn't take long. The House Minority Leader, Republican Joe Martin, who was close with MacArthur, had actually written MacArthur a letter and said, "Do you think it's time that we bring Kai-shek's nationalists into the fight now that China's into this?" Now, Truman had said absolutely no to this, but MacArthur sent back a letter with his personal opinion that yes, I would support that. He had nothing in this letter to say that you need to keep this confidential, and Martin had no intention of keeping it confidential. He read MacArthur's letter on the floor of the House of Representatives on April the 5th. Again, an absolute uproar, insubordination. The Joint Chiefs of Staff now unanimous that President Truman had to do something about it. They all agreed it's time to fire Douglas MacArthur. Now, George Marshall, who had been Truman's Secretary of State, had resigned at the beginning of his second term, is now back as Secretary of Defense. He was unhealthy for a while. He's back healthy. Truman wanted him by his side. Marshall was part of this decision-making process on what to do with MacArthur, and Marshall said the wholly unprecedented situation of a local theater commander publicly expressing his displeasure at and disagreement with the foreign policy of the United States could not be tolerated. He needed to go. The plan was to have the Army Secretary Frank Pace make the announcement to MacArthur that he was being relieved. He was already in the region at the time. But throughout the day, there were rumors of a leak, that something was going on at the headquarters in the Pacific, and that maybe MacArthur had heard about this. And the thought was, well, maybe he would resign first, say something bad about the president, put things on his terms, and Harry Truman wasn't going to let that happen. Truman. Truman said boldly, he's not going to be allowed to quit on me. He's going to be fired. So what do? They called the press together at 1 o'clock in the morning. They held a press conference in Washington, D.C. to announce that MacArthur was being relieved. And there was an uproar in the American people, the press, Congress. There was calls for impeachment of Harry Truman. How dare he? MacArthur's a national hero, a military champion, and who is Harry Truman to actually fire a Douglas MacArthur? That was sort of the essence of the feedback that they were getting. Well, MacArthur was relieved. He and his wife arrived back in San Francisco to a complete hero's welcome, invited to come to Washington, D.C. to speak to a joint session of Congress. 30 million people tuned in on the radio to hear that, and it was a masterful performance by MacArthur. He was kind of at his best, saying, look, I was just doing my job, doing it the best I could. And then he had that famous ending of his speech when he said, old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of the ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. Well, Douglas MacArthur did not fade away. In fact, he went to New York for a ticker tape parade. 7.5 million people showed up. Congress held hearings about the firing. He sat as a witness to those hearings for 3 days and basically said, look, I didn't do anything wrong. I was trying to win the war. I was being hamstrung by these folks back in Washington. But then George Marshall, highly respected Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs all testified to these congressional hearings that the president had no choice. This was blatant insubordination by a field commander. It could not be tolerated. And some of the pro-MacArthur sentiments really started to dissipate. There was a nascent movement to push for MacArthur for the presidency, and frankly, that ended up going practically nowhere. Truman knew that firing Douglas MacArthur was going to be unpopular, and he was right. But he felt he had no choice, really, for two main reasons. Number one, the chain of command, the civilian control of the military, a bedrock principle of the United States really since the founding, was really at risk here. If a commander like MacArthur could basically go against the policy of the president, well, that can't happen in the United States. He had to stand up for that. The other issue, though, was again from a policy standpoint. They were just not on the same page. They both wanted to win in Korea. MacArthur wanted to win in Korea at any cost, even if it meant dropping atomic bombs on the Chinese. Harry Truman wanted to win in Korea, but not at the risk of inviting World War III. It had to take place within the Korean borders, and in the end, Truman was right on both counts. The war would go on for 2 more years, mostly a stalemate in and around the 38th parallel. It wouldn't end until the next president, Dwight Eisenhower, came into place. But in truth, it was contained. The Russians and the Soviets, the communists, were pushed back, and World War III did not start on this watch. In the end, Harry Truman was unpopular, but he made the right calls. That is Harry Truman, Korea, and MacArthur from the life of Harry Truman. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.